Thanks. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak here. Honored to be here. As Jasneet mentioned, my name is Sona Mohnot, and I'm here with the Greenlining Institute. The presentation that I'm going to be talking about today is how do we make equity real in climate adaptation and resilience efforts. You might be wondering, what does that mean? I think by now, equity is becoming a pretty popular mainstream word, but as it becomes more mainstream, there's a risk that if we don't have a strategy on how to achieve it, it'll be an empty promise. And what we want to really make sure is that equity isn't just a commitment, but it's a practice that we're all constantly engaging in. And so today, I'm excited to share a framework that Greenlining developed on how do we operationalize equity in different climate adaptation and resilience efforts. And we recently published a report on this topic, and I'll include a link to it at the end of the presentation if you want to dive deeper into it. So I just want to provide a quick overview of the presentation. I love roadmaps, and I hope all of you appreciate them too. First, we're going to talk about why social equity matters in climate adaptation and resilience. Then I'll provide an introduction to the operationalizing equity framework. And then last, I'll share some examples of local efforts that do operationalize equity so that you have some ideas to think about as you find ways to center equity in the work that you're doing. So first, let's start with why social equity matters in climate adaptation and resilience. So for those who don't know, Greenlining is a public policy nonprofit that works to advance racial and economic justice in low-income communities of color in California. So why does our organization care about climate issues? Well, we've heard from a lot of the speakers today, race, even more than class, is the #1 indicator for where toxic and polluting facilities are located today. And as a result, many low-income communities of color face a number of environmental injustices as well as other socioeconomic challenges. And since climate change exacerbates all these threats, communities of color and low-income communities are often hit hardest and have the least resources to adapt. But as we know, these injustices did not just show up in our communities. They're the result of generations of discriminatory policies that have really created the severe economic and environmental burdens that we see today. So I just want to share a little bit of that historical context before we get into the framework. So the location of Black and brown communities near sources of pollution stems from early government policy from the 1930s. So in the 1930s, in the middle of the Great Depression, many families were struggling to make ends meet and were defaulting on their mortgages. So to help out with this, federal housing agencies began issuing government-backed mortgages to help post-war families build wealth through the Depression. However, not all families received help. To figure out how to distribute the mortgages, government worked with bankers and realtors to create maps to identify which neighborhoods to invest in based on risk. And the map I have up here is a map of Oakland and East Bay communities. These are one of the maps that they created. So they created a grading system based on several factors, like quality of housing to assess risk. But the primary indicator of risk was race. The neighborhoods were graded based on a color code that you can see on this map here. Green meant best, blue meant still desirable, yellow meant definitely declining, and red meant hazardous. Areas that were redlined, which is where the term redlining comes from, were seen as credit risks because of the presence of people of color. Between 1932 and 1962, when redlining was still happening, the federal government backed $120 billion of loans, but more than 98% of that money went to white families. And so the lack of investment for over decades in low-income communities of color has led to the extreme wealth inequality that we see along race lines. And redlining didn't just impact socioeconomic conditions. As people of color were locked into crowded inner city areas, these communities were selected as dumping grounds for urban sources of pollution and contamination. Highways were also used as a way to separate Black and brown communities from white ones, and were often constructed directly through communities of color, exposing them to a lot of transportation pollution. In fact, a 2018 analysis done by the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment shows that 89% of people in California, in the poorest, most polluted, disadvantaged communities, are people of color. And so I wanted to share these two images here The image on the left is the East Bay redlining map that I just showed, and the image on the right is a current day CalEnviroScreen map of the same area that identifies communities that are most impacted by poverty and pollution. You'll see that the red and orange communities on the right, those are the ones that are most impacted by poverty and pollution, are the same ones that were redlined over 80 years ago. And while redlining is one government-sanctioned policy that created inequities along race lines in communities, it's not the only one. Since the founding of this country, on the genocide of Native people, to slavery, to Jim Crow laws, to the Chinese Exclusion Act, to Japanese internment, and to ICE detention centers that we see today, race has always determined the winners and losers in this country. Centuries of discriminatory public policies essentially put handcuffs on Black and brown communities from being able to accumulate wealth, power, and resources. And it's important to remember that this history wasn't created by just a few bad actors. These were all deliberate public policy decisions that were carried out by federal, state, and local government. And while government created these injustices, government can also address them. So as we move forward in developing new policies and programs and plans, we have to acknowledge that race-based policies created and continue to perpetuate the inequities that we see today. And in fact, what we see today is that the cumulative impact of redlining and other discriminatory policies have resulted in segregation, disinvestment, poverty and pollution in neighborhoods of color. And all of this has led to a climate gap, where poor people and people of color are disproportionately and unequally impacted by climate change and have the least resources to adapt. And this is just a few of the headlines that illustrate this point, but there are several more out there. Low-income communities often lack the financial well-being that can serve as a lifeline in cases of emergencies, like having access to a car if you need to escape an extreme weather event, or just having savings in case you're unemployed or experiencing displacement. And so as we think about creating climate adaptation policies and plans here, it's critical that we center equity in them to protect our most impacted communities from climate disasters. And to do that, to truly center equity in adaptation and resilience, we need strategies that provide comprehensive multiple benefits to impacted communities. Because as we just saw, climate disasters don't just impact the natural environment where people live, but can exacerbate existing health, environmental, and socioeconomic inequities. And so the strategies that we need are ones that build the resilience of physical environments, create better health outcomes, enhance economic opportunity, reduce exposure to pollutants, and continuously engage and empower communities throughout every phase from planning to implementation. Excuse me. And so now I'm excited to share the framework that I mentioned that Greenlining developed as a way to achieve these goals. And so if there's one thing about this presentation that you walk away with today, it's these 4 steps that I'm about to share. So for any sort of climate adaptation and resilience effort, equity has to be embedded in the goals, vision, values of the initiative, in the processes, in its implementation, and finally, in the analysis. And the reason it has to be embedded in every single stage is because when policies are developed and implemented without an intentional consideration of equity, racial inequities are likely to be forgotten, reinforced, or sometimes exacerbated. So as we develop new policies and plans to create a more just California, we need to be explicit about how we address equity and constantly think of the barriers that prevent communities from being able to impact decisions that are going to influence them. Because again, equity is not just a commitment. We have to make sure that it's a practice. So I'll go into each of these steps right now and provide an example that illustrates it. So for goals, how do we embed equity in the goals? Equity can't just be a talking point. If a climate adaptation and resilience effort is serious about creating equitable outcomes, then it has to make that explicit in the goals of the effort. A good example that I wanted to share is the Los Angeles Countywide Sustainability Plan. I'm not sure if all of you have had a chance to look at it, but I highly recommend it. The plan outlines what local governments and stakeholders can do to improve the well-being of every community in the county while reducing damage to the natural environment and adapting to climate change. And the plan's organized around 12 goals, and I've included just a couple of them here. So why did I use this as an example? Well, first, equity is not just one of the 12 goals. It's almost built into every single one of the 12 goals, and that's what we want to see. By weaving equity into all sustainability goals, the county will be able to tackle multiple existing inequities at the same time. And I have some examples that illustrate this. So for instance, goal number 1 says, to have a resilient and healthy community environment where residents thrive in place. And the goal explicitly says that the county will protect low-income communities of color from pollution and reduce health and economic inequities. Goal number 3 talks about equitable and sustainable land use and development without displacement, which is another really important equity consideration. Goal number 11 focuses on inclusive, transparent, and accountable governance that facilitates participation in sustainability efforts, especially by disempowered communities. And so the key takeaway here is that equity can't be siloed into one goal because communities require multifaceted, intersectional solutions to truly build resilience. Because a community that's protected from flooding but under threat of displacement isn't truly resilient. In the second step, how do we develop an equitable process? Equity has to be built into the processes of an effort to ensure that communities have an opportunity to influence and drive solutions that impact them. A good example is the Los Angeles County's Measure A, which passed in 2016 and works to provide safe, clean neighborhood parks and beaches for LA County. To inform how the resources from the measure be distributed, the LA County Board of Supervisors approved a countywide comprehensive parks and recreation needs assessment to identify the park need in the county. And the map on the screen shows each area's park need, with green being very low and red being very high. So the process involved a lot of resident engagement and included workshops for the 178 study areas where participants could review their park metrics, identify projects that they wanted to see in their community, and prioritize them. The workshop and outreach materials were also available in multiple languages, so that they could be accessible to linguistically isolated communities. And now, the data from that assessment can be used to equitably allocate funds in areas with very low park need, while also meeting each community's specific needs. The third step is implementation, and ensuring that implementation of a policy actually leads to equitable outcomes. This means understanding community-identified needs and being able to respond to those needs to increase resilience. So I wanted to share an example of an effort that highlights this point. The People Organizing to Demand Environmental and Economic Rights, PODER, is a Latinx base-building and environmental justice organization in San Francisco that collaborated with the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission on this project. They created a new community farm on SFPUC-owned land and converted a 5-acre area next to a park into a community, into an urban community farm. And the farm provides space for members to build food and medicine. And since the park and the farm are important resilience assets in the community, the participants created a community survey and went door to door to ask members about their priorities and concerns and ideas for building resilience. At the end, they created a comprehensive map of existing assets and key climate-related vulnerabilities, along with solutions. And importantly, the strategies were informed by youth and community members. And so through this work, residents increased their capacity to know how to participate in resilience planning and implementation, and created the foundation for culturally relevant solutions for their community. The last step is analysis. And this involves regularly evaluating the successes and problems of the effort so that we can continuously improve the equity outcomes. This was the hardest step to find examples for. We looked over several policies and programs, and equity analysis was almost missing in all of them. However, I did find one example I wanted to share. So earlier this summer, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors approved legislation to establish an Office of Racial Equity. The office will oversee a citywide racial equity plan and will create a racial equity framework that outlines strategies to address racial disparities in San Francisco. Each city department has to adopt an action plan, and importantly, they have to measure their equity progress. So they're going to have to develop new types of analysis tools to assess outcomes. So the effort just got approved, so they'll have to wait and see how it's implemented. But I wanted to put this on your radar so that you can think about, as they develop tools to assess equity, can we replicate some of them in a climate equity context? So that's the last step. I know I went through a lot of information really quickly. The main takeaway here, again, the main takeaway here is that whatever adaptation effort you're developing, I'm hoping those 4 steps can help serve as a roadmap or guidance to ensure that equity is centered in whatever you're developing. I only went through a few examples, but again, the report we published recently, it's a very long document. It has a lot of other examples and best practices, so definitely consider looking at that if you want to find more information on this. Thank you.